As the two men rode up the road towards the small town, the tension between them was palatable. While they wished no harm to anyone they might meet, they knew that they were not welcome here. If they were discovered, not only would it mean the end to their mission, but, possibly, their lives. Nevertheless, they traveled across the mostly flat expanse of farmland, dotted with lakes and small groves of trees that offered occasional shelter from the wind blowing in off the sea. As they approached their destination, they first saw the great fortress cathedral atop a hill overlooking the town. Its 50-foot walls, constructed of red brick made from clay of the surrounding countryside, were cliff-like in appearance, and the towers and red tile roof gave it both a gravity and levity that seemed to anchor it to the earth below and let it reach into the sky above. It dominated the small town that clustered near its walls facing out to the sea. In its side was a small gate, and it was here that the young man was asked his business. "I've come to see the doctor," he replied. "Can you tell me where I might be able to find him?" "Through the gate here, down the road along the wall. Go nearly to the end past the long building, and there will be a newer road that goes to your right. Climb the hill there, and you'll come to a group of larger houses. It will be the last one there, overlooking things." As the young man remounted his horse, and he and his companion moved through the gate, he felt both relief and a growing sense of excitement. There hadn't been any questions about where he was from, which might raise suspicions that he was, in fact, a Lutheran deep into a Catholic territory that had expelled all Protestants from its lands. That was a concern he could let pass now, at least for the moment. As they traveled on the old road between the town on their left and the cathedral on their right, they could smell the docks. With each step, the young man's excitement grew as he realized he was about to meet the most reclusive scholar in all of Europe. At least so it seemed. When he reached the new road, the horses struggled up the hill, and soon they had a view into the grounds of the cathedral behind the wall, as well as of the building itself. It was as grand and beautiful as any of the great cathedrals to the south, but instead of opening onto a city square, it was kept hidden behind the fortress wall and surrounded by this meager fishing town. The two men dismounted in the common field the houses shared, and the younger man asked for the other to see to the horses. From his saddlebag he took a heavy satchel and walked towards the door of the house he reckoned to be that of the man he had come to see. He knocked on the door, and when a servant answered it, he asked again if he might see the doctor. The servant asked him to wait, and a few minutes later an older man appeared. He was slender, with keen eyes and high cheekbones. Even though he looked tired and a bit haggard, it was obvious that he was a high-born and proud man. Still possessing of all his hair, streaked with gray though it might be, he was handsome and noble. "Doctor?" "Yes." "My name is Georg Joachim Rheticus, and I have traveled quite a ways to see you. I come bearing gifts from the scholars of Nuremberg, and I hope to spend some time with you, discussing your researches into the motions of the heavens." "Well, it's been quite some time since I've had someone from beyond my little world here come to talk to me of such things. Please, won't you come in? You can call me Nicolas."
Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery.
Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 13.1, Supplemental. Copernicus and Rheticus. Part 1. And so did the meeting of the two men come to pass in May of 1539. Their collaboration over the next 4 years would serve to change humanity's ideas about its place in the cosmos. But to understand how the meeting came about, we need to go back some 66 years to a different town on the banks of the Vistula River. The town of Torun was, and still is, located in a region known as the Baltic Littoral. At the time of Copernicus's birth in 1473, it was a land with a complex history. In the 12th century, it had been part of the territory of the Prussians, one of the last non-Christianized Germanic peoples of Europe. In 1226, the Duke of Poland, tired of the constant raiding and skirmishing between his people and the Prussians, invited the Teutonic Knights to settle the region, promising them any lands they conquered. Returning from the Crusades, the Order of the Knights of the Cross took up the offer with a practiced savagery and soon exterminated or enslaved the Prussians, establishing a kingdom of their own to the west of Lithuania and north of Poland they called the Teutonic Order State of Prussia. As they took control of the region, they built fortress cathedral complexes made of bricks created from the red clay so prevalent in the region. The knights then invited German, Dutch, and Danish farmers to come cultivate the land, and these immigrants soon settled near the fortresses for their protection. Copernicus's ancestors were among these settlers, arriving from German lands to the west in the 13th century. In time, they moved further east again to settle in Krakow, where they became part of the burgher class, and in 1396, Copernicus's great-grandfather was granted citizenship in that city. By the mid-15th century, relations between the Teutonic Knights and, well, pretty much everyone else had deteriorated to something between a Cold War and outright hostility. It was during this time that Copernicus's father, also named Nicolas, left Krakow to follow what he saw as a business opportunity. The city of Torun had chafed under Teutonic control, and in 1454 its citizens, with the support of the now King of Poland, had seized the Teutonic fortress there and declared themselves independent. Nicolas Sr. had traveled to engage in business and to use his financial resources to underwrite the armed rebellion that had now engulfed the entire region known as the Prussian Estates. This conflict, known as the 13 Years' War, provided the elder Copernicus ample chance to turn a profit by providing loans to the region in order to clothe, arm, and feed its troops. In addition, he served in various administrative roles and even built a bridge from the city over the Vistula River to the farmland on the other side. This activity brought him to the attention of the richest and most influential family in town, the Watson Rhodes. And in the way of such things, he was soon married to one of the daughters of the family patriarch Lucas. The marriage was beneficial to both, especially when Lucas died after a few years in 1462 and left a very healthy inheritance to his son-in-law. 4 years later, the 13 Years' War was brought to a conclusion, with the Prussian estates, on Polish backing, defeating the Teutonic Knights and securing their emancipation. As the war had started in Torun, the peace treaty was signed there, and a new arrangement was arrived at. For his trouble, the now King of Poland would be named sovereign of the region, which consisted of the 3 city-states, Torun, Elblag, and Gdansk, and the 4 dioceses or bishoprics that would be ruled by what were known as prince-bishops, meaning that they held both political and ecclesial authority in their regions. The interesting thing was that these Prussian estates, or Royal Prussia as they would come to be known, would retain a fair degree of autonomy to run their own affairs in the peace. The whole region was ruled by a council that consisted of each of the prince-bishops plus a representative of each major city-state. But it was the Bishop of Varmia that was considered to be the first among equals in this new governing body. It would be the son of Lucas Watson Rhode, the brother of Nicolas Sr.'s bride, who would be the first occupant of this position. The Copernicuses, Nicholas and Barbara, had 4 children, Andreas, Barbara, Catherine, and Nicholas the Younger over the next few years, between about 1470 and 1473. 3, Andreas, Barbara, and Nicolas the Younger would all end up in the service of the church, with only Catherine marrying and raising a family. The family lived the good life of wealthy merchants and landowners in a large home near the center of Turin. Over the next few years, Turin, already prosperous, flourished as a major site for trade along the Vistula. It had joined the trading empire of the Hanseatic League, and so was part of a cosmopolitan network that brought goods and merchants from all over Europe to the city. As a boy, young Copernicus would have grown up in a clean, well-administered polity with the city square as his front yard. His immediate family was connected to the innermost workings of the city, and his extended family was involved in the details of running the entire region. Now, before we move on, a few more words about politics and administration of the region, as these will be important in our story going forward. The first thing to understand is that when the Teutonic Knights were defeated in the 13 Years' War, they were not completely stripped of their possessions. They retained a province that more or less surrounded Varmia. Now, Varmia was an interesting construction that ran north and south from the Baltic Sea along the Vistula River, and it sort of stuck like a thumb into the Teutonic territories. As you might imagine, this left Varmia in control of the trade along the river and some of the best agricultural land, something the knights would covet for a very long time. The second thing to note about this is how the region was administered. While the Council of Seven made the laws, they obviously couldn't administer everything themselves. Given that the areas outside the cities were to be overseen from within the framework of the church's diocese, it fell to that structure to handle the day-to-day work of collecting taxes, arbitrating disputes, and enforcing justice. To do this, there was a council of 16 men called canon, who were tasked with these responsibilities. Now, since the city of Turin was nominally independent of the region of Varmia, the canon couldn't meet in the church there. Instead, they were located at the northern edge of Varmia, at the cathedral in a small little town of Fromborg, sometimes called Frauenburg, at the place east of where the Vistula emptied into the Baltic Sea. This would be the place where Nicolas the Younger was destined to spend most of his adult life. When Nicolas the Younger was 10, his father passed away, and the family passed into the care of his maternal uncle, also named Lucas Wazenrode. Lucas had just been elected as canon of Fromborg, and would, 6 years later, be elevated to the position of Prince Bishop of Varmia, and thus de facto leader of the Prussian estates. Since being a canon required an oath of celibacy, Lucas had no family, and so he took in his sister Barbara and her children to raise as his own. This is a good place to take just a moment to talk about Lucas Wazenrode just a bit. The process of establishing the semi-autonomous nature of Royal Prussia in general, and Varmia in particular, was not a particularly smooth affair, especially as the King of Poland wanted the right to appoint the prince bishops in order to secure his claims to the region. Wazenrode was part of an active resistance to these efforts that occasionally flared into hostilities. Over the course of the period between the end of the 13 Years' War and his rise to the position of Prince Bishop, Wazenrode was involved in any number of conflicts, negotiations, and treaties that eventually placed him on the throne, as it were, of the region in 1489, with the blessing of Pope Innocent VIII over the objections of the Polish king, who was eventually forced to accept that while he would have some input on the selection of the bishops, it would be limited at best. What we can see here is that Lucas Wazenrode must have been a talented diplomat, possessing a strong will through which he could bend events and individuals to his cause and purpose. As you might imagine, this did not end when he came to be named bishop, and I'm going to guess that there weren't many who could stand in opposition to his idea of how things should go for very long. This would be the environment in which Nicolas, now no longer the younger, would spend many of his formative years. While we don't have any record of the relationship between the two, I can imagine that Nicolas learned early that his uncle was not a man to be trifled with or ignored. In the case of his new charges, it seems pretty clear that his idea was that the extended family would continue to play a significant role in the running of Royal Prussia. And so the two boys would be groomed to take their places among the canons, and Barbara, the younger of the two I should say, would be sent to live with a religious order of nuns in the neighboring bishopric of Klimno, where she would, in due time, rise to the position of Mother Superior. The two brothers, on the other hand, were tapped to follow in their uncle's footsteps. During their time in Turin, they would have attended church-run preparatory schools, and in 1491 they were sent to the University of Krakow to study the quadrivium, just as their uncle had done years before. It's pretty clear that Nicolas and his older brother Andreas were very close, as the older man waited to begin his university education until his younger brother could go with him. Andreas was the more carefree and outgoing of the two, while Nicolas was more introverted and studious, and these personality traits would grow as time went on. Andreas was also more carefree with his use of money. While Nicolas paid his tuition up front, Andreas reserved a part of the money for his own use and would eventually end up in debt to the school. One can imagine the two traveling further up the Vistula, the river that would so define their lives, aboard a broad-sailed Lodi, to Krakow full of excitement and wonder. This was the seat of the King of Poland, and the city was altogether a step up in grandeur from the elegant but still provincial Turin. Crossed by wide straight boulevards and dotted with elegant churches, it was a diverse city filled with people of all nationalities and origins who had come to the city at the crossroads of two of the busiest trading routes in Europe. The university sat at the center of the city, with students renting rooms and hostels near the buildings of the campus. The Copernicus brothers took rooms with a friend of their uncle, likely arranged prior to their arrival, as so many things were. The owner was one Piotr Łapowski, and Nicolas and Piotr's son, Bernard, would form a lifelong relationship during this time. Bernard would become one of Europe's foremost cartographers in time, and he and Nicolas would work on more than one project together. As we mentioned in the last episode, the years in Krakow were reasonably productive for the two brothers, and it is there we see Nicolas's interest in astronomy really bloom. To expand a bit on the comments from the last episode, there are a few things to note. First, the news of Columbus's discoveries really energized the campus, and especially Nicolas. This was because of the implications on that field related to cartography and astronomy known as cosmography. Cosmography was the study of humanity's place in the structure of creation, and the news of Columbus's findings in what were being called the West Indies required a lot of new work in that area. I would imagine that it was the topic that occupied many of the conversations between Nicolas and Bernard as they worked to recalibrate and broaden their sense of the scale of the size of the Earth. As you may recall, there was at the time of Columbus's voyage a debate as to the size of the Earth given the ambiguities and discrepancies that had arisen in understanding the work of first the Hellenistic natural philosophers and then the Arabic and Islamic hakim. While there had been those, Columbus included, who felt that the Earth's sphere was small enough for the ocean-going vessels of the time to traverse, his travels, once truly understood, and that was a process that took some time, showed that had he not run into the New World, he and his crews would surely have perished because the journey would have been far too long. Second, the faculty there was truly first-rate, as noted by German cartographer Hartmann Schedel, when he wrote, quote, "There is in Krakow a famous university, which boasts many most eminent highly educated scholars, and in which numerous liberal arts are practiced. But the science of astronomy stands highest here, and in all Germany there is no more renowned university in this respect, as I know exactly from the narrations of many persons." End quote. These two factors, when combined, led one of the university's most prestigious alumnus, Martin Bielica, to send a number of state-of-the-art astronomical instruments to Krakow for use there by the faculty and students. As a side note, Bielica had been the one who had persuaded Regiomonte to leave Rome to come to the library in Buda under the patronage of the King of Hungary. Third, as mentioned previously, there were a number of interesting or rare astronomical events that took place during the Copernicus' times in Krakow. These, combined with the new instruments, would have made it an extraordinarily exciting time to be participating with the scientific community at the university. I can tell you from experience that nothing fires the imagination more than looking into the heavens, and to do so while observing an eclipse or an occultation and taking measurements of that event was likely quite exhilarating for Nicolas. Finally, one other thing we should mention is that during this time throughout Europe, there were a flood of new ideas coming from new translations of Greek works that had come out of Constantinople. The Arabic/Islamic tradition, through which Europe had received much of its knowledge, had been heavily focused towards the writings of Aristotle, as we've discussed in some great detail. As the works of Plato became better known, there was a rediscovery of the philosopher's emphasis on order and beauty in all things, with the accompanying centrality of mathematics as a language of expression for that structure. It is almost certain that as Copernicus was exposed to these ideas, they would have influenced his thinking as he learned some of the more cumbersome aspects of first Bach's new theory of the planets, and later the epitome of the Almagest. This may well have been the genesis of his disdain for Ptolemy's use of the equant, something that would grow over the intervening years. Along with these astronomical events, there were a number of political occurrences that took place in the city as well. In 1492, shortly before the arrival of the news of Columbus's voyage, the King of Poland, Casimir IV, died, and there was a huge coronation event that followed. In that same year, part of the university's facilities burned to the ground and had to be rebuilt. 2 years later, the city was visited by a trade delegation from the Ottoman Empire, led by a sultan, who brought with him the, at least at the time, amazingly rare sight of 16 camels. It's hard not to think that this sort of environment wouldn't have captured Nicolas's imagination and fired his curiosity. I wonder too, though, if all of this didn't also create a certain conflictedness within him. Nicolas had been sent to Krakow to become an administrator, and perhaps, if he were talented and strong-willed enough, to actually even replace his uncle Nicolas when the older man had died. And yet, here was something in astronomy that he truly loved to do. It was a discipline worthy of his intellect and more suited to his introspective disposition. And so, I kind of wonder if he hoped that his seemingly less talented and less disciplined brother might be a bit of a late bloomer and relieve him of some of this responsibility of carrying the family name forward and continuing that tradition of running Varmia. If this were the case, however, he would be deeply disappointed, as things would not turn out very pleasantly for his older sibling. In 1495, the brothers left the University of Krakow to return to home in Varmia, though probably not to Turin. By this time, Lucas had been elected to serve as the Prince Bishop of the region and now resided in the Bishop's Palace in Litzpark. While we don't know if either finished their degree, we do know that Nicolas a year later would set out for advanced study in canon law at the University of Bologna. 2 years later, his brother would join him. Here again, Nicolas was following his uncle's footsteps, and again, we get a sense that while studying law might have been the primary reason he was sent to the great university, his interests quickly turned to astronomy and mathematics. It was here that he would read, for the first time, a well-printed version of Regiomonte's Epitome of the Almagest and encounter the first serious criticisms of Ptolemy's model beyond those associated with a certain lack of mathematical elegance. The biggest criticism Regiomonte had raised regarding Ptolemaic theory, at least as far as Copernicus was concerned, had to do with something known as lunar theory. Since Ptolemy's model used a combination of epicycles turning on deference to describe the motion of the moon, the distance between the Earth and the moon would vary dramatically. This, in theory, should have caused the size of the moon in the sky to change by nearly a factor of 2 over the course of a month. As this obviously didn't occur, Regiomonte raised questions regarding the accuracy of Ptolemy's model. It should be noted that similar arguments could be used in the case of other planets, especially Venus and Mars. It was during this time that Mirandola's work, Disputations Against Divine Astrology, was published. As we mentioned, It highlighted the Ptolemaic model's inability to give an order of the planets in terms of their distance from the Earth. While Ptolemy had put forward a suggested order for the planets, it was based more on hunches and guesswork than anything mathematical and concrete. This, in turn, fed into the lack of an overall cosmology in the Almagest, leaving the astronomer of the late 15th century at a loss for guidance on how to organize creation. While Ptolemy had suggested a complete picture of the heavens, including the various sizes of the epicycles and deferents of the planets in his work Tetrabiblios, the book had been lost to history at that point and was only rediscovered in the 20th century. While in Bologna, as we said in a previous episode, Copernicus rented a room from Domenico Maria Novara, and it was in working with the former student of Regiomontes that he learned and practiced the advanced techniques of astronomy and would likely have been further schooled in the works of Plato. As we mentioned, Novara was an original thinker who suggested that the precession of the equinoxes could be explained by assuming that the Earth was not completely still, but rather that its axis might change its orientation with respect to the rotating sphere of stars over time. Perhaps it is here, with this one very small change, that the revolution was truly started. On March 9th, 1497, Copernicus would make his first observation with Novara, measuring the occultation of the bright star in the constellation of Taurus, known as Aldebaran, by the moon. Years later, Copernicus would cite this observation in his description of lunar motion theory in De Revolutionibus. By 1500, he was making his own observations, measuring conjunctions of Saturn with the moon on January 9th and March 4th. In the second half of that year, he traveled to Rome for the Jubilee and delivered lectures on mathematics and astronomy before recording his final significant observation of this period, measuring a lunar eclipse in the early morning hours of November 6th. From these events, we can see that Nicolas was an active participant in the intellectual and scholarly life of Renaissance Italy. However, over all of this hung the responsibility that awaited Copernicus at home. In the same year as he began his studies in Bologna, Nicolas's uncle Lucas had arranged for his appointment as one of the 16 canons of Frombork, a position he held in absentia until he completed his course of study. The positive side of this was that the position provided Copernicus with an independent source of income, allowing him some latitude from the financial restrictions placed on his life by his uncle, who had funded his education up to that point. On the not-so-positive side, though, the appointment basically locked him into a life of being a church administrator on the coast of the Baltic Sea for the rest of his days. In 1501, he was called home to formally take up this position, and during that time he asked to be granted 2 more years of study, this time at the University of Padua in the medical arts. As there was a dearth of competent physicians in Royal Prussia, and to a lesser extent all of Poland at the time, his request was granted. This extended his Italian stay till 1503, when his options of continuing his education away from home more or less came to an end. The grant was supposed to be for the study of medical astrology, but it is likely that Copernicus used the time to study Arabic and Islamic astronomy in greater detail. To show that his time in Italy hadn't been wasted, he stood for and earned a degree in canon law from the University of Ferrara, likely chosen as a way to avoid the expense of having to host all of his friends and professors at a lavish banquet upon the degree being awarded. And so it was that Nicolas Copernicus returned to his homeland to take up his appointment as a canon for good. His first assignment, again likely arranged by his uncle, wasn't to take up the traditional duties as a canon, but rather to serve as Watson Rhodes' private secretary and chief advisor. This is the place where I imagine things got really disconcerting for the 30-year-old Copernicus. He had just spent the last 7 years in the heart of the Italian Renaissance, surrounded by the greatest minds of a generation. These were the years of Da Vinci and Machiavelli, Michelangelo, and so many other great thinkers, and he had to leave and return to the place in Europe that was about as far away from any of that as a person could go. Had Nicolas had a disposition for politics, I think he might have found much in royal Prussia to keep himself occupied, but instead he was a man for the stars. I can imagine, though, that his uncle, someone much more used to the practical rough and tumble of palace intrigue and state building, found Nicholas's interests about as useful and relevant as spitting into the Vistula River. Lucas Wassenrode had carved out a piece of the world called by its inhabitants Ermeland, mostly free from the interference of the Polish kings and Teutonic knights through brilliant diplomacy, strength of arms, and sheer will. So despised was Lucas Wassenrode by the knights that they included in their daily prayers a request that God remove, quote, this devil incarnate, unquote, from the world. He hadn't needed the motions of the stars in the heavens or some arcane mathematical scribblings to do that, and so he likely viewed these interests of his nephew as frivolous. Instead, he would have worked to focus Copernicus's mind on the tasks he would one day need to succeed his uncle: hard-nosed diplomacy, fair and pragmatic administration, and the efficient collection of rents and taxes. And so it was that Nicolas learned to keep the former intellectual interests to himself while learning the latter while being at his uncle's beck and call. From the events we know about from later in his life, he learned the lessons well. Even as he was cut off from the heart of European intellectual life, there were still those in his neck of the woods with whom he kept up. One of these was his old friends from Krakow, Bernard Wapowski, and another was his geography professor, Matthew of Michał. Later, he would add a fellow canon, Tiedemann Geiss, to those to whom he would open his mind in life. It would be through correspondence with these men and a very few others that Copernicus would share his intellectual pursuits as time and occasional travel allowed. One of the things that can be seen throughout Copernicus's life was an ability to form and foster relationships that were warm and close. There weren't a whole lot of them, but the ones he had were really, really deep. As we will see going forward, it's Copernicus's seeming ability to combine these aspects of Stoic duty with Epicurean relationships that will characterize much of his life. For about 6 years, he worked in the service of his uncle in Litzbark, also sometimes known as Heilsberg, which was about 40 miles east-southeast from the cathedral in Frombork. Occasionally he traveled with his uncle on business in the region, and in 1507 his skills as a physician were called into use as he tended to the bishop who had become seriously ill, nursing him back to health and thus receiving a bonus for his work. In 1509, though, Copernicus made it clear that while he respected his uncle, he had no intention of remaining in his service. That year, he published a collection of translated poems from the 7th century Byzantine historian Theophylactus Simocatta, something pretty idiosyncratic. One reason for this work may have been to affirm his commitment to his uncle's humanistic ideals while also expressing his desire to separate himself from the path that the elder man had picked out for his talented but much more introverted nephew. Copernicus dedicated the work to Wassenrode, observing in the introduction that there are different types of people, some who prefer, quote, levity and bright fantasy, end quote, but also those inclined to, as he put it, seriousness and grave realism. Comments that likely revealed his uncle's pragmatic and realpolitik worldview while avoiding being critical or unkind about it. After 6 years of service, Copernicus likely understood what it took for the citizens of Varmia to enjoy the relative autonomy they had been granted, but he also knew that he had little taste for the work himself. From the notes he left at the end of the pages of one of his books, it's clear that he's still looking at the sky during this time. We discussed his observation of the planetary conjunctions of 1504 in our last episode. Given this and his translation work, it's reasonable to conclude that he was still intellectually active, even if only in the spare time left to him by his uncle, which may not have been much. In 1510, he made what he thought was a reasonable compromise between his desire to live the life of a solitary academic and his duty to the land and people who had paid to educate him when he left the position as the bishop's secretary to take up his formal role as canon of Frombork, a position he would occupy for the rest of his life, save for a 5-year reassignment we'll discuss later in the episode. Frombork was a town of about 1,000 people located 20 miles east of where the Vistula River entered the Baltic Sea. Apart from the cathedral, it would have been a fishing settlement that worked a sheltered bay known as the Frisius Hof, formed by a barrier island created by the sediment carried into the Baltic by the Vistula and distributed by the currents of that larger body of water. The canons were men in a liminal space, halfway between clergy and nobility. They were required to take the first level of holy orders, similar to those of monastics in some ways, and were encouraged to stand for the priesthood, though not required to do so. Copernicus would resist this second step his entire life, for reasons we'll discuss down the road a bit. The canons would be required to assist in the serving of Mass at the cathedral and to assume various leadership roles in its administration on a rotating basis, but these responsibilities didn't actually take up a great deal of the canons' time. The majority of their work would be on the secular side of the appointment. Canons were a bit like English knights in this part of their role, in that they were required to keep a certain number of horses, servants, and weapons for use in the defense of the region if called upon. Moreover, they were required to oversee the collection of taxes and rents of the landholders, settle various disputes, and act as judges in matters of criminal behavior. Depending on the workload, this part of the job could be very time-consuming, and it is here that Copernicus's apprenticeship under his uncle would prove most beneficial, as he would be among the most effective canons during his 3 or so decades in the position. Now, being a canon did come with a number of perks. First, the income was such that one who held the position didn't have to worry about making ends meet. Rather, life could be pretty comfortable if one managed the various streams of revenue and income well. Second, the canons were provided residence both within the cathedral complex and outside of it. While most of the canons took quarters within the church building itself, Copernicus selected one of the towers in the fortress structure surrounding the cathedral. It would allow him space and privacy to work and make astronomical observations. Just outside the walls of the cathedral complex, he also owned what was called a curia. This was a large home where he could spend time and receive visitors that were not associated with the formal functions of his being a canon. His curia would share a large yard with 2 others, and he would add to it a porch that would shelter his astronomical instruments from the ever-present wind when he made measurements there. It would be during his first few years as a canon that he would produce the Commentariolus, the proverbial tip of the iceberg of the deep thinking he was doing in astronomy. As we've mentioned, we don't have any real record of what was going on during this time or what his thought process was, but sometime in the 10 or so years between returning to Varmia in 1514, he became convinced of a heliocentric model of the solar system, and also did enough work on the mathematics to believe that he could support the conclusions he had come to. The document, copied out by hand on a limited number of manuscripts, was circulated among Copernicus's small group of confidants initially, but as is often the case with radical ideas that have a certain internal logic, the document would percolate out into the broader world, though the process would take a number of years. One thing that we know is that if there was any response to the ideas, it was kept between the author and the recipient, and likely only discussed in personal meetings. We have no letters between Copernicus and the people he sent the Commentariolus to. Why is this? There are likely a few reasons. First, the Commentariolus, while strongly declarative in its tone, is a tentative foray into the world of cosmography. While Copernicus may have felt that he had come across a more satisfactory explanation of the motions of the heavens, he may well have been afraid that his ideas would not be taken seriously and that he would be ridiculed for them. Secondly, the ideas themselves were really radical. As we said in our last episode, Copernicus asks his reader to consider several entirely new conceptual frameworks that would have strained even the more flexible of minds. There were things like an Earth that was spinning and moving with a tremendous velocity. And then there was a complete redefinition of what a planet was, and finally the huge expansion of the size of the universe. Third, while the ideas put forward in the Commentariolus were self-consistent, they were presented with no observational or mathematical support. These factors likely contributed to the slow dissemination of the model, even as its novelty would have propelled it beyond the somewhat isolated world of Northern Europe. Following the distribution of the Commentariolus, Copernicus's time as a canon in Frombork was relatively benign for the next few years. It may have been during this time that he wrote an essay on economic theory that may well have been the first expression in Renaissance Europe of what is known as Gresham's Law. The idea of the essay, which was titled, by the way, Essay on the Coinage of Money, was that economic systems where coinage is based on precious metals and those are used as a medium exchange. The coins with inferior metal values will force those with superior values out of circulation. This is usually stated as bad money drives out good. While the British economist Gresham was the first to write up this idea and publish it for others to read, it's clear that Copernicus's essay, likely written for his fellow canons and perhaps the ruling council of the region, predates Gresham. While there are those who claim that Copernicus should be credited with the discovery of the idea, it seems to me that there may well have been someone who understood this as far back as the Roman Empire, given that polity struggles with currency, whose writings did not survive the fall of the Western Empire. I have to say that I wish that there was a bit more time to discuss this particular contribution of Copernicus's, as I find economics a fascinating subject, but we still have a good deal of ground to cover, so I'll leave it as an exercise for the listener to discover the finer points of the theory. You know, in my college textbooks, the authors were always doing that to us students, forcing us to scramble around to find something in case we might end up missing a vital point, which, of course, was never actually what happened. I've always wanted to continue that fine tradition, but you, the listener, should know that if you don't stop the podcast and go look up Gresham's Law right now, you'll be none the poorer as far as things from here on out go. We won't actually talk about it again. Okay. In 1516, Copernicus was selected to go and oversee the administration of one of the towns within the Frombork administration district, a town called Ulsten. This required him to move to the town in order to administer it in the surrounding countryside. While there, he did continue his astronomical studies. We know this as we have etchings he made in the plaster walls of one of his workspaces while doing his work. While the post likely kept him busy with the various tasks we've already discussed, there would have been some time, especially during the long winter nights, for him to work on the mathematical underpinnings of the heliocentric theory. This, however, probably came to a screeching halt when, in 1519, the Teutonic Knights decided they'd had just about enough of the political arrangement that made them little more than another province under the sovereignty of the Polish king. Seeking a bigger seat at the table, they invaded the region of Varmia with about 5,000 armed men, and soon torched and looted Frombork itself, sparing only the cathedral. The canons fled to Gdansk and other cities, with the exception of Copernicus, who stepped up to organize a defense of Ulsten. About a year after the sack of Frombork, the knights showed up and demanded the town's surrender. Copernicus, knowing what the fate of the city would likely be if it capitulated, defied the army camped outside the town's walls, and with some help from a unit of the Polish cavalry that showed up at a good time, managed to hold off the marauders. Settling into a siege, the knights soon realized that the last canon of Frombork had prepared his people for the long winter months more thoroughly, and thus was faring better in the harsh weather. As such, the siege was soon lifted, and a few months later, the knights, running short on money, withdrew from the region altogether. I think here, perhaps more than anywhere else, we see Copernicus's stoic nature. He could have, like the other canons, run for the safety of a more fortified and better defended city and abandoned the people of Varmia to the vicissitudes of war. Instead, he recognized his duty, one I guess he dreaded, and stepped up to lead the defense of the people in his care. To me, of all the episodes in his life, this may be the most remarkable. I may be reaching here, but I think that Marcus Aurelius, had he been around, would have expressed more than a little bit of admiration for the scholar of Frombork. A few years later, Copernicus participated in the negotiations that brought a more lasting peace to the region, and that continued to guarantee the autonomy of that area. His skill as a diplomat, something he no doubt developed in his service of his uncle, and his reputation as a more than competent military leader, cemented by his defense of Ulster, would have given him a certain cachet in the negotiations, both with the Polish king and the Teutonic Knights. In 1524, he wrote the review of the scholarly work on the motion of the eighth sphere, or the sphere of the stars, that attempted to explain the observation of precession. As mentioned in the last episode, this review was rather critical of that author's approach, and while it did not mention Copernicus' commitment to the heliocentric model, it is clear from his comments that he is well committed to it. It also seems to indicate that he has made a good deal of progress on solving the problem of precession in his own work, a vital step if the ideas that have been expressed in the Commentariolus were to become a proper mathematically based theory. At this point, Copernicus's life lapses into silence for a time. While there were things taking place, they lived more in the realm of personal drama within larger currents, and thus we'll shift our focus to those for a time. For our narrative, we can best understand these larger forces by looking at the life of one Georg Joachim Rheticus, the man who, with his companion, would come to visit Copernicus on that day in 1539. Born Georg Joachim Iseren on February 16, 1514, in the town of Feldkirch in the old Roman province of Rhaetia, Rheticus was a child of many cultures, and one of the first generation for whom the printing press was a reality woven into the fabric of learned society. His parents were of the privileged class, his father a university-trained physician, and his mother from a wealthy family. The two had moved from Lombardy to this region at the corner of Germany, Austria, and Switzerland with their first child, a daughter, and had settled in the town built on a major trade route connecting the Germanic north to the Italian south across the Alps. Feldkirch boasted the possession of a recent institution, the grammar school, which introduced its students to the subjects of the trivium at an earlier age, starting them down the road of a liberal arts education aimed at freeing them from ignorance even as they were learning the fundamentals of their faith. It would be here, as well as under the direction and encouragement of his parents, especially his father, that the boy would first learn a love for the humanist ideas flowing out of the Italian Renaissance. One of the things I would think would be a good thing to mention here at this point is that Rheticus is perhaps the best example of the generational shift that occurs with the establishment of the printed word in Europe. In contemporary times, it's become useful in some ways to think of generations as being defined by the technologies that were ubiquitous as they came of age. For baby boomers, it was the automobile and the associated infrastructure with the freedom of movement that those brought. For Generation X, it was the television. Millennials were the first generation to have access to object-oriented computing systems from the time of their birth. While each of these technologies were developed by innovators of the previous generation, it could be said that the technology wasn't fundamentally woven into how they thought of the world, how they constructed their paradigm. For the succeeding generation, however, each technology, with both its advantages and pitfalls, would be a given part of their lives, so deeply ingrained within it that it factored into all of their planning and decision-making. In the early to mid-1500s and beyond, this technological divider was the availability of not only the printing press, but also the infrastructure of ink, paper, printers, and distribution channels that made books cheaper and possible in greater numbers. For men like Copernicus, born in the mid to late 1400s, the printing press would have seemed something of a novelty. Communication would still have mostly occurred through manuscript distribution. Only the most important books, things like the Bible or the Almagest, would have been published. By the time Rheticus reaches schools, towns such as Feldkirch can plan the development of the first community libraries. Books are now cheap and plentiful enough that they can be accumulated in the hundreds. Moreover, it's not just books that will be printed, but pamphlets and, as we'll see, speeches. Even with the integration of this new technology into the fabric of culture, though, it's still something of a limited resource. Typesetting a book is a time-consuming process, and so decisions about which books were to be printed and how many were to be printed required a setting of priorities. Then, like now, the publisher and the printer both had to be convinced that a book would be a financial success and enough copies would be sold to make it worth their time and effort. Depending on the book's length and complexity, a print run of 300 copies could take over a year to produce. That's a lot of investment of time and energy, and so what got published often were those things that met the tastes of the market rather than what might have been seen as more beneficial. During young Joachim's life, the market seemed to desire the newer works of humanist thinking. In practical terms, at least at this stage, that meant the Greek works that had poured out of Constantinople just a few generations earlier. As the writings of men such as Plato, Apollonius, Galen, and Euclid came into Italy in their original tongue, they had to be first translated and then understood, a process similar to what had happened with the works of Aristotle 4 centuries earlier. As I mentioned in our series on the atom, the writings of Plato are heavily influenced by the ideals of the Pythagoreans, who saw harmony, whether in music or nature, as a fundamental way of understanding human experience, whether that be of the natural world or the interaction between people. These harmonies were best, or at least most clearly seen in mathematics, which served as part of the inspiration of Plato's theory of forms. As these works filter their way into Europe, they profoundly influence the Italian Renaissance in everything from music to architecture. And as the geometry of the Greeks begins to mix with the algebra of the Arabs, there will be an acceleration of the development of new branches of mathematics and the tools associated with them. Our man Rheticus, of course, will play an important role in all of this. But let's get back to his life. As a boy, he would have grown up with a number of material advantages. His father was a working professional, and his mother came from money, so it's unlikely that early on he would have lacked for anything. We know that his parents, especially his father, took an active role in his education, encouraging his curiosity and helping him to appreciate the wonders of what he was learning. Unfortunately, Joachim's father also had something of a tragic, fatal flaw. He was a swindler. While there would be later stories of the doctor being some sort of Faustian necromancer who kept live demons chained in his basement, and no, I'm not making that up, the truth of his downfall is much more worldly. In his apparent greed, Rheticus's father resorted to swindling his patients out of their money and even stealing items of wealth from their homes, and even their pockets as he treated them. He was charged with larceny and dishonesty in the discharge of his duties, and after a somewhat lengthy but fair trial, was convicted of the charges and sentenced to death. While he was granted the nobleman's mercy of a quick beheading rather than the slow strangulation of hanging, the other part of the sentence was that his family name of Icerin had to be stricken from the records and forbidden from being used by his wife or heirs, something known as damnatio memoriae, or literally, damning the memory. Thus it was that Georg Joachim came to be lacking a last name. For a time, he took his mother's maiden name, but when he went off to university, he, as was the custom, took a Latinized form of the old Roman name for the province from whence he came. Fortunately for Rheticus, his mother's wealth allowed him to continue his education past grammar school, and he traveled to a church school in Zurich to further his learning. And this is where we run into the other great thread of the time, the Protestant Reformation. Rheticus was no more than a toddler when Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg as a response to the Catholic practice of selling indulgences in 1517. While the ensuing events are beyond the scope of this podcast, there are a few things to be noted. First, what happened afterwards was something that took time to develop. It wasn't some sort of Luther defies the church and he's off to the races. Rather, there was a good bit of back and forth before the final break in 1520 or so. Second, the Protestant Reformation is successful in part because the German princes were more than a little tired of taking orders from Rome. Hence, when Luther went off the reservation, as it were, the Prince Elector of Saxony, who I mistakenly identified as the King of Saxony in our last episode, gave the reformer the necessary shelter from the individuals in the Catholic Church who might have seized and killed him, as they had done with others before him who had challenged papal authority. Third, Luther's embrace of the printing press as a preferred means of communication of his ideas meant that he could stay in areas that were safe while his ideas didn't have to. One of the places where those ideas found their way was Zurich, through the person of Ulrich Zwingli. By the time Rheticus arrived in the Swiss city, it had become a bastion of the Reformation thinking, and soon the young man was immersed in its ideas. For 3 years he would study under the direction of Oswald Myconus, a colleague of Erasmus Reinhold, who we'll have much to say about later. Myconus was a fundamental figure in the spread of both humanist learning and the Reformation, but in our narrative today, he must play a rather small part. One of Rheticus's closest friends during his years in Zurich would be Conrad Gessner, who would go on to become one of the leading zoologists in Europe during his generation. In 1531, Rheticus left Zurich, having completed his education there, and returned home. In his absence, a new doctor, Achilles Gasser, had moved into town to replace the young man's father. In a turn filled with psychological resonance, Gasser would be profoundly impressed by Rheticus's intelligence and learning and would become his greatest promoter for a time. Gasser had studied at a number of prestigious universities and was well connected. Over the course of the next year, he would become a father figure to Rheticus and would groom him to continue his education at a university. In 1532, Rheticus, bearing a letter of introduction from Gasser, departed for the now 30-year-old University of Wittenberg. Founded in 1502, it had grown quickly and become established as a center of mathematics before Luther assumed control of the institution as part of his desire to reform all aspects of spiritual and intellectual life. By the time Rheticus arrived, Luther's right-hand man, Melanchthon, was the rector of the university, teaching humanities and theology there, and, as much as anything, fostering a strongly humanist liberal arts curriculum that would become a signature aspect of the institution. The young man enrolled in the fall with 290 other students and soon found himself immersed in Luther's Reformation worldview that supported a priesthood of all believers and the idea that it was through close reading of both the works of man and nature that one could come to fully know God. As Dennis Danielson writes in his excellent book, The First Copernican, quote, "Given the long-standing analogy between the book of God's words, the Bible, and the book of God's works, the creation, there was also a natural analogy between the sets of tools used to interpret these two books, literacy and linguistic knowledge on the one hand, and mathematics applied to careful observations on the other." End quote. Rheticus, enthralled by this integration of faith with learning, soon converted to the Reformation. Part of this had to do with Luther's view of the harmonies of music and marriage, where he allowed the clergy to take spouses and the congregation to sing, thus pulling each other more fully into the other's sphere of experience through active participation in their joys and exertions. Luther would write, quote, "Here, in polyphonic singing, it is indeed excellent how one and the same voice carries on singing the tenor, while at the same time manifold other voices wonderfully circle around it, moving playfully, exultantly, joyfully, and at the same time embellishing it, as if leading it on a divine dance. And for those who in the least feel its effect, there is nothing more marvelous in the world." End quote. It was in these ordered harmonies that so many scientists of the burgeoning revolution would find and extend meaning. From Copernicus's spheres in motion, to Kepler's structures of Platonic solid, to Galileo's recognition that much of the aesthetic beauty of the heliocentric system could be found in the fact that the Earth was no longer, quote, "excluded from the dance of the stars," end quote. This was an alluring counterpoint to the Catholic synthesis of Augustine, Aristotle, and Aquinas prevalent to this time. Rheticus had little contact with the towering figure of Luther, who represented such a contrast of extremes as the years went on, but he did interact extensively with Melanchthon. Luther's lieutenant was a humanist of the highest order, even before becoming a Protestant, and so it was that he recognized the kindred spirit in the young man early on. Again, as with others, the full breadth of Mechthiol's influence ranges far beyond our journey, but it was in 1532 that he took Rheticus on as a protege, declaring that he was natum ad mathemata perseviganda, quote, born to study mathematics. Over the next 4 years, Rheticus completed the course of study for both the Bachelor's and Master's of Arts with highest marks. In 1536, Melanchthon made him an unheard of offer. Recently, the university's senior mathematician had died. While the position was to be offered to Erasmus Reinhold, a second, junior position was to be created, and it would be offered to Rheticus to keep him at Wittenberg at the heart of the growing Reformation. The young man, no doubt flattered by the offer, accepted immediately. In his lectures, he emphasized the connection between music and mathematics. Moreover, he encouraged his students to love the work of mathematics not only for its utility as a tool of investigation, but for its own inherent beauty, saying, quote, "It is characteristic of the honorable mind not to love anything more ardently than the truth, and inspired by this desire, to seek a genuine science of universal nature, of religions, of the movements and effects of the heavens. If we are held by admiration and love for this perfect science, then we also need to value those elements of numbers and measures that provide access to the other parts of philosophy, although even on their own they are of great nobility and benefit." End quote. For the next 2.5 years, he taught well, giving inspiring lectures and mentoring students until he was caught up in a scandal that convinced both him and Melanchthon that some time away from the university on sabbatical might be for the better. The thing that he unwillingly got caught up in had to do with something that happens a lot at universities. As a junior member of the faculty, he had a habit of gathering with others roughly of his same age and experience who perhaps lacked a bit of the moderation and wisdom of their elders. As can be the case, a group of this sort can be a bit irreverent towards the august traditions and personages of a place, even if that place is less than 50 years old, and thus will have a bit of fun at their expense. Usually such jests are little to worry about other than a few ruffled feathers and grumbling statements about how nothing is still respected, before folks move on, with the junior faculty eventually becoming senior faculty who are then the subject of a new round of pointed teasing. In this case, however, a poet by the name of Simon Limnius chose the suggestively erotic work of Ovid as a framework with which to lampoon some of the august personages of Wittenberg, most notably Luther himself, in a collection of poems dedicated to Luther's archenemy, the Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz. Luther, so often thin-skinned in his response to confrontation, quickly escalated the situation, and soon Limnius found himself run out of Wittenberg. In response, the poet wrote a defense or apologia of his work, naming a number of his drinking buddies in Wittenberg as character witnesses, including Rheticus. Given this unfortunate turn of events, Melanchthon decided that it might be a good time for the young mathematician to get out of Luther's sight until things blew over, and so arranged a scholarly sabbatical for the winter of 1538-1539. When Rheticus left, he was accompanied by Nicolas Gugler, a young student from the city of Nuremberg, destined to be Rheticus's first destination. Upon their arrival in the city, they sought out Johann Schoner, a 61-year-old cosmographer and heir to the works of the mathematician and astronomer Regiomonte. Schoner was a maker of well-crafted globes of both the earth and the heavens, and a professor of mathematics at the gymnasium of the city. Gymnasia were a new type of institution that had been instituted by Melanchthon that sought out students of high ability and accelerated their education and scholarship, thus preparing them for study at the university level more rapidly. At the time of their arrival, Schoner was in the possession of a map by Martin Waldseemüller, which for the first time contained an outline of the eastern coasts of the New World with the title America. Schoner, likely due to his connection with the works of Regiomonte, was also a publisher of mathematical and scientific works. Recently he had published for the first time Regiomonte's great work on triangles, with the help of the talented local printer by the name of Johannes Petraeus. Schoner took Rheticus under his wing and introduced him to the intellectual elite of Nuremberg, connections Rheticus was to use later in life. It is also likely they either told him about or showed him Copernicus's Commentariolus for the very first time. Now, in this work, Copernicus had hinted that there would be another work that would explain the mathematics that supported the model, but it had been 25 years and nothing had been forthcoming. Both Schoner and Petraeus were active in their pursuit of high-quality scientific works for publication, and they were keen to have a shot at seeing the manuscript of Copernicus's more complete description of the heliocentric model to see if they might be interested in printing and distributing it across Europe. Upon leaving Nuremberg in late 1538, Rheticus continued to travel southwest, stopping in several places and creating connections and relationships in each before arriving in his hometown of Feldkirch. At each stop, he soaked up the research and the ideas being discussed and asked about the Commentariolus. From these conversations would arise several of his later works, things we'll return to on our next episode. In May of 1539, Rheticus returned to Wittenberg and asked that his sabbatical be extended. He had an idea. He wanted to travel to Frombork, the home of this mysterious canon, to see if there was a manuscript supporting the heliocentric model that was worth publishing. The idea had captured his imagination and fired his desire to see the truth and beauty of it all. The new rector of the university, Caspar Cruciger, thought it was an intriguing idea and approved the trip. This time, Rheticus would take along as a traveling companion a student, Heinrich Zell, who was closer to him in age and a bit more experience. The two set out on May 14th and reached Posen, where Rheticus sent back a letter to Wittenberg. From there, they likely traveled to Torun and finally to Frombork. As they approached, little did either man know that Rheticus would not just spend a few weeks with Copernicus, but the next 2.5 years. The intervening years hadn't exactly been easy ones for Copernicus. Already an introvert, the canon had drawn into his own world when first his uncle died, and then more so when his older brother perished in 1525, likely of leprosy. The two had been extremely close, and with Andreas's passing, it is likely that Nicolas felt that he had lost the one final person who truly understood him. This is not to say that there were no other friends, as we will discuss, but rather that there was likely no one other than one other person who truly understood his inner life. The problem here is that this one other person was not exactly someone with whom he should have had the relationship he did. As I mentioned earlier, Copernicus, in his role as a canon, had been required to take the first level of orders, like I said, a sort of set of monastic vows that included a vow of celibacy. What seems clear is that, like a number of others who found themselves in similar circumstances across Europe, both Copernicus and some of his fellow canons discreetly ignored these particular vows. Even those who did not take mistresses understood that the decision to adhere to them was a personal matter, and thus were silent about the affairs. The woman Copernicus seems to have entered into a relationship was with his housekeeper, Anna Schilling. Now, Anna was an extraordinarily bright woman who would have been able to keep up with Nicolas's mind and participate both in his life and his investigations. In 1537, though, this relationship came to the attention of the new bishop of Varmia, one Rheticus, who after a series of affairs of his own had come to Jesus, as it were, and forbade his canons from having mistresses. In a series of increasingly nasty confrontations, Copernicus was forced to put Anna out, a turn of events that no doubt furthered his sense of isolation. As if to add to this misery, Copernicus was also implicated in a rumor that the canons were considering a conversion to Protestantism, something that had taken place in the provinces of Prussia just to the west of Royal Prussia. While certainly unfounded in Copernicus's case, one of his fellow canons had clearly flirted with the ideas coming out of Wittenberg to the south. And so it was that in March of 1539, Rheticus outlawed Protestant literature and expelled anyone associated with Lutheranism from Varmia. I think it had to be something of a low point in the now old canon's life. Little did he know that in 2 months, a young scholar from the heart of the heresy would show up on his doorstep bearing gifts and seeking conversation. And so it was that the two men came together and formed a collaboration that would spark a revolution that changed humanity's understanding of the cosmos. The part of the tale regarding the events that led to the publication of De Revolutionibus will have to wait until next time, as this episode has grown prodigious in length. When we take up the story once again, we will trace the ins and outs of getting the dog-eared manuscript from Frombork to a published book with an introduction no one expected or approved. From there, we'll trace the tragic career of Rheticus, from its zenith to its collapse, and then to a turn of redemption not unlike the stories of Purbach and Copernicus himself. Thanks for taking time to listen to the show. If you're looking for a fuller account of the life of Rheticus, may I recommend my main source, Dennis Danielson's The First Copernican, Georg Joachim Rheticus, and the Rise of the Copernican Revolution. It's really a fantastic read, as it delves deeply not only into the lives of Copernicus and Rheticus, but also of those with whom they interacted and the culture of the Northern European Renaissance in which those lives took place. It's a period of time that holds within it many of the seeds of our modern world, and understanding it helps to understand a lot of what still exists today. If you haven't already done so, why don't you consider subscribing to the podcast on whatever service you're listening to this on? Also, if you're enjoying the program, leave us a strong review and consider sharing the show with a friend or two. By the way, to the person who promoted the podcast out on Reddit, thank you very much. For those of you who have subscribed on the basis of that recommendation, welcome aboard the Odyssey. Find a bunk, stow your gear, and get ready for more exploration. If you haven't already done so, check out our catalog of back episodes, where you can get caught up on this particular voyage or look at some of our other explorations. Be sure to like our page over on Facebook to keep up with some of the science stories we're following, and if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, you can do so at Chad Davies, all one word. Be warned, though, that this is my personal account, so know that I'll probably bombard you with some of my personal thoughts on current events and things going on in my life. No apologies on that, but just so you're aware. So until next time, full sails on your journey.